Early in December 1980, an unknown young man traveled to New York City to kill the most famous rock singer in the world. This is his story, told by those who knew him and loved him. This is also the story the killer told afterwards to detectives and psychiatrists. And it is a story about the power of stories, and of one story in particular. A story that took place somewhere else, in someone's imagination. A story from the words of an old song that would become the key to a killing. On the evening of Monday, December 8th, 1980, the young man stood outside John Lennon's New York apartment. Here, in the killer's own words, is what happened next.
If you ever get a chance, go to the Dakota building. Just look at it and think that's where it happened. There was no emotion, there was no anger, there was nothing. It was dead silence in my brain, dead cold quiet. He walked up, he looked at me. I'm telling you, the man was going to be dead in less than 5 minutes, and he looked at me. And I looked at him, and he walked past me, and then I heard in my head, said, do it, do it, do it, over and over again. Do it, do it, do it, do it, do it, like that. Pulled a gun out of my pocket. Put my hand into my left hand. I don't remember aiming. I must have, though, but I don't remember drawing a bead or whatever you call it. And I just pulled the trigger steady 5 times.
This individual, who is unidentified at this point, but will be identified soon, fired 5 shots from a .38 caliber Charter Arms pistol. Mr. Lennon was struck several times. We're not positive at this time as to how many times he was struck.
He's dead. He's coming back.
It appears at this time that the individual is from out of town, possibly Hawaii. That's the way it looks at the moment.
Was he a screwball? What's his at the time?
Hey, this looks familiar. Does it?
Mr. Chapman, is that you in there?
The unknown young man, 3 hours after he killed John Lennon. His name was Mark David Chapman. This police video shot that night through a 2-way mirror marked the beginning of the investigation of what turned him into a killer. Police had found Chapman minutes after the shooting, waiting quietly at the scene of the crime. He had dropped his gun. In its place, he held a paperback novel. Inside, he had written, "To Holden Caulfield, from Holden Caulfield. This is my statement." From that night onward, the catcher in the rye haunted the investigation of Lennon's death.
Let me have your date of birth, okay?
May 10, 1955.
And that makes you how old now?
25.
Okay, and you spell your first name?
M-A-R-K.
In prison interviews with detectives and psychiatrists, Chapman constantly returned to The Catcher in the Rye. Anyone, he said, who understood the book would understand why.
And you read the book, and you think about me and the terrible fall, and you read, "I'm sorry I told so many people about it. Don't ever tell anybody anything." And it might hit you. You might really come to the full scope of understanding of what I've stood for in my life, what the terrible fall was, and what I'm doing now, and what I will be doing in the future. It just might come to you. I'm praying that it will, and that you realize that something very extraordinary has happened with an extraordinary book, and without ego, an extraordinary person. And Lennon, an extraordinary person. The Beatles, an extraordinary cultural movement in the 60s and early 70s. Probably the cultural experience, musically and culturally. They changed the world as we know it. And I changed them.
At his trial, Chapman pled guilty. His testimony was never heard. The only statement he made was to read a passage from The Catcher in the Rye.
The reason I killed John Lennon was to gain prominence, to promote the reading of J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. I'm not saying I'm the Messiah or nothing like that. If you read the book and if you understand my past, but you seem to understand my past pretty well, and you would see that I am indeed the catcher in the rye of this generation.
Our book for discussion in class this morning is J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. It is a book that is at the top of the list of the most banned books in the United States.
The banning of The Catcher in the Rye in many American schools is an ironic fate for such an acclaimed work of literature. This funny, sad novel about a teenager driven to despair by the phoniness and hypocrisy of the adult world has been so often outlawed by other adults.
The theme of phoniness certainly is a predominant theme throughout the book.
A crusade against phoniness, one critic called it. Teachers know how deeply the book impresses some teenagers, and how deeply they identify with its hero, Holden Caulfield.
But listen now anyway. He started concentrating again. Then he said, "This fall I think you're writing for is a special kind of fall, a horrible kind. The man falling isn't permitted to feel or hear himself hit bottom. He just keeps falling and falling."
He tells him it's a special kind of fall. It's a horrible kind. And it is. Look at what's happened to my life on the surface. I murdered a man. But not only did I fall, but I took a lot more with me than just myself. A whole era ended. It was the last nail in the coffin of the 60s.
There's a place I go where I don't know who I am.
This is a recording Mark Chapman made of one of his own songs, written in the late 60s.
It doesn't matter who you are.
Mark was born in Texas, but grew up here in Decatur, Georgia, a quiet, respectable suburb near Atlanta. Later, he would speak of an unhappy childhood in this house, with a father he called cold and unresponsive. But his mother, questioned after the killing, said she noticed nothing wrong in these early days. At first, he had done well in school. Everything seemed normal. But when trouble did come, Mark's problem seemed only a sign of the changing times. In August 1964, the Beatles came to America and were greeted by a level of teenage hysteria unprecedented in the country. But if they spoke to a new generation, they would also disturb and enrage adults, especially when John Lennon said the Beatles were more popular than Jesus Christ.
No, but I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. You know, I just said what I said and it was wrong or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
This is Doug Layton and Tommy Charles. We're reminding you that our fantastic Beatle boycott is still in effect. Don't you forget what the Beatles have said.
Don't forget to take your Beatle records and your Beatle paraphernalia to any one of our 14 pickup points in Birmingham, Alabama, and turn them in this week if possible.
The Beatles would ride out the storm of protest. But John Lennon, sharp-tongued, hard-edged, and philosophical, had already begun to stand apart.
Had it been another day, I might have looked the
In Georgia, teenager Mark Chapman was caught up in the times. He wore a Beatle haircut and sang Beatle songs. But there were more profound changes.
falling, yes I am falling, and she keeps calling me back again. Falling.
Drugs had come to Mark's high school. Students boasted that Columbia High was the #1 drug school in the state. As Mark slipped into the drug culture, he became known as a garbage head, someone who would take almost anything. At home, he became hostile and rebellious. When he was 15, he ran away. Later, after taking LSD, he spent the night in jail. He was at his lowest point, when suddenly he heard another voice.
Falling, yes I am falling, and she's calling me back again.
You know, all across the country, there's a real Jesus revolution going on. He is the ultimate eternal trip. And we want you to go out and share everywhere that you go what Jesus Christ has done.
In 1971, this service in a local church, conducted by a California preacher, Arthur Blessed, was one of several religious experiences that suddenly brought Mark Chapman to Christ.
Many of you just made a real commitment of your life to Jesus Christ. And at his place, when someone turns unto Jesus, we have them share their testimony. And many are loaded on drugs or have drugs in their possession. So we go into the restroom and we have a toilet service. And we read a passage of Scripture and we say a word of prayer. And then we drop the drugs in the john. And just as we start to mash the handle down, we sing a little song that says, down, 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 all my dope is gone. We flush her down. Remember, Jesus Christ is life's greatest trip.
I had an encounter with Jesus Christ, and he came into my life. I was just nothing but a dope head, and I asked Christ to come into my life. And he came. I mean, I didn't see him, but he was there. I mean, I knew he was there, and I felt forgiven of all my sins, and felt like my life was headed on the right track again. I read the Bible, and I worked in inner city Atlanta with kids that you just wouldn't believe.
It was after his conversion that Mark met the girl whom many years later, in prison, he would still call his only one true love.
He had changed his drug days. He had changed into being a Christian. He had very high morals, very high standards for himself and for me, and we were not to sway from those standards. At 15, as in love as I could be at the time. And, of course, he was 17 and growing up, a little bit more grown up than I was. But yes, we were in love. There's no doubt about that. He had his own ways of thinking about things. That's the only way I can describe it. He had his own way of how he felt about things, about real things. And that's the way we had to be with each other. It was very honest and open. He had there was no place in our relationship for anything that was phony. No lies, no games. It was me in the end that said goodbye, and it was very hard for Mark. He didn't go on. He didn't say, okay, you know, so that didn't work. Now I need to pick myself back up and maybe spend some time with myself, and like all of us do when a relationship comes to an end. And we learn from it, and we go on. That didn't happen with Mark. Talking to you has, you know, brought a lot of things back for me. And I remember quite clearly finding out and how shocked. It wouldn't register for the longest time. And now it's like, I feel totally helpless almost, you know, what could I do? Everyone, I can't even tell. I can't tell friends because they would hate me. I had nothing to do with it, but there's very few people, you know, that I would even tell about this. It's a very hard thing to think about him spending the rest of his years there, you know, because he was such a special person. Such such a kind and gentle, very gentle person. I'm not undermining in any way what he did. And for a long, long time, and still, my sympathies for Yoko and all of the people that loved Lennon so much, that is so strong in me. But I also try to separate that, as I said, separate the Mark that I knew from what really happened. And it wasn't Mark. It just wasn't. He couldn't have been in his right mind when he did it. There's just no way.
Mark Chapman was 16 when he read The Catcher in the Rye for the first time. He was the same age as the book's hero, Holden Caulfield. In the book, Holden's crisis is about growing up. Mark had now begun to spend more time with children. He had applied to become a camp leader for the YMCA in Decatur, where he worked for Vince Smith.
I knew Mark Chapman quite well. He served as assistant director when I was director at Camp Coda. He was particularly good with little children. In fact, I've never seen a boy of his age that was so good with little children. He was like a Pied Piper. They'd follow him around. He struck me as just a fine young boy. I didn't see a fault in Mark. He tended to have grand ideas that would, grand passions that would stick with him. And then one day they'd be gone and another one would come back. I felt that the Catcher in the Rye business was one of Mark's passions, but I didn't see anything, and I'm familiar with the book, I didn't see anything in there that made me think that was going to be a more serious passion in another book. In fact, I figured that next week he'd have another book that he'd be trying to get everybody to read. He certainly didn't seem like Holden Caulfield to me. And Nemo was his camp name. Nemo.
And I called myself Nemo for 7 years at the YMCA day camp, until I found out what Nemo means in Latin.
What's it mean?
It means nothing. Literally nothing.
Well, Cindy was a very shy child, and she was 9 years old the summer she started to camp. And the first day that I took her, she was very nervous and cried, and I left her crying. And I worried all day, of course, how she was doing. And when I came back to pick her up, she was walking up the hill, and she had her arm around Mark, and he had his arm around her. And there was this big smile on her face, and I knew that she had found a friend.
He was just totally honest, totally sincere. He truly cared for me. And that is very odd for an adult to react that way for a child. He did not treat me like a child. He never spoke to me like I was a child. He spoke to me like I was his age and that I could understand everything that he was saying to me. But then again, he didn't really act like an adult.
Well, it was unconditional love on your part that you had for Mark. There was no criticism or...
No.
You accepted him as he was and loved him as he was. And I think that's the reason that Mark became close to me. Well, I think the fact that he was so gentle and passive with the children was a lot of what he wanted to be. He wanted to portray this very kind, gentle person with the children because he loved them very much. But obviously, like any other young person, he did have problems in his life.
He really never said much of anything negative.
Well, I think he did express at times that he was disappointed in people, that they didn't live up to what they should, that they needed to give their very best at all times and that they did not. But as far as any specifics...
He did say that when someone was gone, they were dead.
Yes, he did have an expression that once you did something that made him very angry, to the point that he never wanted to see you again, he would say, well, he's dead. And I questioned him about that one time. I said, they've died? And he said, no, not really, they've died, but to me they're dead. So when you did fall out of grace with Mark, he marked you off his list.
And Lennon fell out of the grace of Mark.
Someone asked us not long ago if we feel any hatred or any hostility toward him for what he did. Although we were appalled at his crime, no one can condone murder, can they? We were shocked and we were horrified. But to us, he was still the Mark who loved us and who gave us so much of himself. And we will always love him.
Mark served the YMCA with distinction. They sent him briefly to Lebanon, and then in 1975 to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, to help refugee children from Vietnam.
My name is Mark Chapman, and I came to work at Fort Chaffee about 3 months ago. This is truly one of the best experiences I've ever had. It's so good to work closely with the Vietnamese people and to exchange culture and ideas.
Despite the confident voice on the camp radio and glowing reports from his superiors, all was not well with Mark Chapman at Fort Chaffee. He was closer than ever to the children, still the Pied Piper, the cheerful organizer of camp games. But to his co-workers, he appeared tense, often moody, frequently depressed, a loner. To one friend, it seemed Mark had fallen out of grace with himself. Certainly, he had changed.
And from that point on, I didn't really go towards Mark like I used to. I didn't run up and hug him. I would speak, but I would keep a distance. It wasn't like he was the same person I had known at camp. He came to visit one time, and he came into the kitchen, and I started to run up to hug him, but his face looked different. His eyes were cold, and I backed off, and Mom says, aren't you going to go up and hug Mark? And I kind of shook my head, and I said, he looks different. She says, it's the same old Mark. But it wasn't the same old Mark. He had shark eyes, and he had no feeling in his face. He looked very cold and very unhappy, and he scared me.
Something was going wrong. Something he could not control. Something he had to escape. In 1977, Mark Chapman came here, to Hawaii. He was 22 years old. In the past year, he had walked out of the YMCA. He had flunked out of college and broken off an engagement. He had come to Hawaii to escape everything. He had decided to spend all his money in the hotels along Waikiki Beach, and then to kill himself. He was a young man chased by depression and what he saw as a series of failures. On June 20th, he drove to a remote beach. He connected a hose to the exhaust pipe and tried to asphyxiate himself, but his suicide attempt failed when a fisherman knocked at the car window. Later in the hospital, Chapman told doctors, I think of myself as a boxer in the 27th round, my face all bloody and bruised. He could give no reason for his depression. It was just there. In the late 70s, John Lennon, who had spent so much of his life in the public eye, withdrew into private life. For 5 years, he gave no interviews and made no records. He had disappeared from the public stage. In the fall of 1980, journalist Larry Shames got his first big assignment. Esquire magazine wanted him to find out what had happened to John Lennon. But the now reclusive former Beatle wouldn't talk. So when Shames discovered Lennon had bought an exclusive estate on Long Island, he set out by boat to investigate.
The Lennon I went looking for was a man who had always taken chances, musical chances, political chances, chances with his own sanity. I went looking for the Lennon who, by his appalling honesty, had shamed the world into examining itself. I went looking for the Lennon whose pained, goofy, earnest, and paranoid visage was the emblem and conscience of an age. The Lennon I would have found was a 40-year-old businessman who watches a lot of television, who's got $150 million, a son whom he dotes on, and a wife who intercepts his phone calls. He doesn't do ridiculous things anymore. He stopped making errors, and he stopped making music.
Shames never did reach Lennon himself, but his article on what he did discover revealed a far more comfortable side to the rock star's tough, iconoclastic image. Mark Chapman read the Esquire article. Later, he would admit it intensified his desire to kill John Lennon.
I felt just terrible when I heard about Chapman. The thought that my article in any way might have been one of the things that went through his mind was devastating to me. The article at the beginning had been undertaken rather in the spirit of a journalistic caper. The reporting itself was fun, and Lennon himself in life was such a towering figure that it didn't seem that he could in any way be hurt or even really touched by this sort of story.
In Hawaii, Mark Chapman's own story had entered a new chapter. He now saw his failed suicide as a message from God that he should make a new life for himself. He settled here on the island of Oahu. At Castle Hospital, where he had been treated after the suicide attempt, he stayed on to become a popular and useful employee. To friends like Judy Harvey, Mark seemed cheerful, outgoing, and untroubled by his past problems. Others were not so sure.
On the surface, I think most people would say that Mark was getting along fine, that he was well-balanced, that the past episode in his life when he tried to take his life was over, and that he was doing well. But there were certain little glimpses you would get of Mark occasionally that would let you know that things weren't all just right. When he was down, he was quiet, he was sullen, he really didn't want to talk too much. I didn't see Mark vent any of his anger or unhappiness in any violent way, but I would describe it as being sullen, and he would sulk. It seemed to be he would just not want to talk. You could always read Mark's moods like a book. You could come in the morning, and the first glance at Mark and the expression on his face, you knew what Mark's frame of mind was.
In 1978, Mark met Gloria Abe, a travel agent. The following year, they married. But despite the romance, Mark's spells of depression continued, to the growing concern of his friends.
We were concerned because of Mark's history and the fact that he had tried to kill himself, and when he would sink into a depressed mood, that would get some of us rather worried. And granted, all of us have ups and downs, but with Mark, the ups seemed to be a little higher and the downs seemed to be a little lower. And with his history, we were concerned. These were markings and signs of a very troubled young man, capable, we thought, of inflicting damage to himself. As I mentioned to you before, when we heard that he shot John Lennon, it didn't particularly surprise us that he was capable of violence. We just didn't think he would direct the violence at someone else.
Throughout 1980, Mark's cycle of depression became deeper.
Think about it. Hawaii, beautiful place to live. Weather's perfect. Then it would be ideal. It would be like the Garden of Eden. But I was getting depressed again. And I was just sick and tired of everything. Things I thought were going to be so good, and they turned out the exact opposite.
It was the fall of 1980. It had been a year of projects taken up enthusiastically and then suddenly dropped. Now he decided to read every book in the state library in Honolulu. But he found something that reawoke an old passion. Chapman read James Lundquist's critical study of J.D. Salinger and re-entered the world of The Catcher in the Rye, and its hero, Holden Caulfield. In September, he tried officially to change his name to Holden Caulfield. He wrote to Professor Lundquist, signing the letter a 25-year-old catcher. And he kept reading.
I checked out a book about John Lennon, and when I read it, I found out some strange things he did, and I was probably angered at his phoniness. I mean, I wasn't fuming, but I was saying what a fake he was, what a phony he was. Then I thought to myself that I was going to kill John Lennon.
For Lennon, there was no escape from fame. The images of his long career of public exposure were simply too powerful. His public stunts had summed up so much of the iconoclasm of the 60s. In Chapman's mind, the new Lennon had betrayed the old idealism.
We feel that instead of making war, it's better to just stay in bed. Let's stay in bed for the spring.
And grow your hair.
Yes.
For peace. Let it grow till peace comes, you know.
Those beddings for peace, Lennon publicly stated that they were, it was phony. He stated that himself. He said it was a publicity thing. He sang about peace. He sang about giving things to charity. He protested, he whined, he screamed, he went through the primal scream bullshit. You know, it's all that self-centered baloney. The man was just, a complete phony.
Somewhere that the war movement is over.
If a body meet a body comin' through the rye were the first words of Robert Burns' famous 18th century song. But in the novel The Catcher in the Rye, Holden Caulfield is spellbound by a young child singing, "If a body catch a body comin' through the rye." It's that misunderstanding that gives Holden an image of himself, an explanation for why adults become phonies, and why innocent children need a catcher in the rye.
Holden sees himself standing on the edge of a cliff and stopping children from accidentally falling over. The cliff is symbolic, or rather, the fall of a child is symbolic of the transference from adolescence to adulthood. When a child falls off the cliff, he becomes an adult. 9 times out of 10, he becomes a phony. Holden doesn't want to see that. He wants to see the whole world full of nothing but children, non-phonies. And he wants to catch them and keep them. But you see, what happens to Holden is he does fall off the cliff. He does fall. And that's what's happened to me. I will never hit bottom. Never. I'll just keep falling and falling and falling. I fell off the cliff, but I never did become an adult.
On October 23, 1980, Mark Chapman signed his timesheet, John Lennon, and quit work at the hospital. 4 days later, he bought a gun, a .38 caliber Saturday night special. At his apartment in Honolulu, while his wife worked, Chapman stayed home, listening to Beatles tapes and making his plans.
I want to tell you, I had it made. I had a great one, fantastic apartment. Everything was just on the surface, tremendous. What happened? I don't know what happened. I just got depressed again, quit my job, bought a gun, and came over here and killed somebody. That's what happened. From heaven to hell in about a month.
In November 1980, Chapman arrived back in Atlanta. He had just spent a week in New York, waiting in vain to see John Lennon.
The last time I heard from him was in November or in the first week of December. I remember on the phone he said, "I won't be back through here again." And I said, "What do you mean? You won't be back into the States," meaning from Hawaii again. And he said, I just don't think I'll be back through Atlanta again. And he said, "I'd like to get together." And I thought we could talk over old times. And I was very uncomfortable with that. I felt like, why do you want to talk about old times? You know, this is now, those were then. I thought that was all settled. I thought that was all settled. And he got very upset, and he said, "Aren't they important to you?" I remember him almost at the point of tears, you know. It was very emotional for him. Aren't they important to you? So that was the time that last I could have seen him. And I guess we never said goodbye. And it's not that he's dead in my mind. It's that he's gone. I guess he was gone a long time ago, and I just didn't know it. In a sense, I think he stayed back in 1972.
But Chapman's return home had another purpose. He had come to buy bullets and for target practice. 5 years earlier, Verlin Florence had taught him how to shoot.
Mark Chapman was a little better than average shot. If he were a academically graded student, that would be about a C+ for ability. He was like this distance from me. My grandmother, who has been dead many years, couldn't miss you at this range. The fact that he had any training at all at this range has nothing to do with anything. Where your training is in value is when you go backwards and when that other person can shoot back. Lennon, as far as I know, wasn't armed, was he? No. So was Chapman in any danger? None whatsoever.
On Saturday, December 6th, 1980, Mark Chapman returned to New York City. New York was where John Lennon lived. It was also the setting for The Catcher in the Rye. In the book, Holden Caulfield wandered through New York for 3 days, from Saturday to Monday, his desperation growing. Now, from Saturday to Monday, Chapman too wanders through New York, looking for John Lennon and walking in the footsteps of the catcher. In the book, Holden annoyed taxi drivers with the question, where do the ducks in Central Park go in the winter? Now he goes to Central Park to ask the same question. In the book, Holden checked into a cheap hotel but felt ill at ease in his small, miserable room. Now Chapman checks into the YMCA on 65th Street. He quickly becomes dejected in his $16 a night room. In the book, Holden hires a prostitute, but tells her he doesn't want sex. He just wants to talk to her. On Sunday night, Chapman does the same. He pays the woman twice her normal rate and sends her away. Later, Chapman would say these coincidences were just accidental, signs that destiny was at work. The story of the Catcher in the Rye ends back in Central Park at the Carousel. Here, as Holden watches his little sister go round and round, the tired, confused young hero of the novel finds a kind of grace and relief from the mental turmoil that has haunted him. But for Mark Chapman, watching the Carousel that weekend, there would be no grace. For him, there would be one more chapter.
Do you think Holden's a real nice kind of a guy and everything? He wouldn't hurt a flea? Well, he wouldn't, at least up to the point in the book. I think Holden was capable of killing someone.
While Chapman sat by the Carousel, a few hundred yards away, John Lennon and Yoko Ono were at their Dakota apartment. In the past few weeks, Lennon had suddenly emerged from seclusion. He had released a new album and was giving long interviews in the press. For Chapman, those interviews and the songs on the new album seemed to sum up Lennon's whole life. Later he would say it was as if Lennon had recognized his destiny and had foreseen that their two paths would converge.
People say I'm crazy, doing what I'm doing. When I say that I'm okay, well, they look at me kind of strange. Surely you're not happy now, you no longer play the game. I'm just sitting here watching the wheels go round and round.
Doing what I'm doing. Well, they give me all kinds of warnings to save me from ruin. I'm just sitting here watching the wheels go round and round. I really love to watch them roll. No longer riding on the merry-go-round. I just had to let it go. It's incredible. The whole thing is just incredible. Does this person look like a person that could shoot somebody?
Chapman had moved to the expensive Sheraton Center Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. On Monday, December 8th, he woke up late, around 10:30. He dressed and then on the bureau created a display of his possessions, his Bible, his passport, and a still from his favorite film.
I just got up and laid out the things and went down and bought The Catcher in the Rye. And I went outside in the street and I wrote, "To Holden Caulfield, from Holden Caulfield." And I wrote, "This is my statement." And I just knew that I'd never return. That's the way destiny works. You don't always question it, you just do it. I kept saying, just go back to the hotel, pack your bags and go home now, you know. Don't do it. Go back to your hotel. Get the doorman to get you a cab right now. Do it now, you know. But I didn't do it. I stayed. It was like a movie. It was like I was in a movie. I got a gun. I got hollow point bullets. I thought he would just drop right in front of me, and that was it. Well, he was about 25 feet away, but I thought he was just going to fall down, like in the movies. Fall down dead. The guy had 4 holes in him. Big hunks came out of him. They had to. The hollow point is a 38 caliber. My God, it's enough to knock a man on his feet. I don't know why I chose him exactly, but I was just fed up with the world, and I thought if I murdered this guy, then it would be all over for me. And then that would kind of be a solution in a way to everything. But kind of, the self-destruction would be a blessing. If you knew what Holden went through, and if you knew that Holden wanted to die, really, then you'd understand. And Holden had kept it in for so long, and yet he understood what he was doing. He understood that it was against phoniness. And
if at first Chapman's motive was a mystery, it immediately became the subject of debate and conjecture. There was no shortage of explanations. But while the headlines tried to satisfy the public's need to understand, there was a more private battle going on over the content of Chapman's mind. The prosecution believed he killed Lennon to become famous. The defense, because he was insane. The psychiatrists disagreed. Before them was a young killer who knew he was Mark Chapman, but also claimed he was the personification of a fictional character.
But you see, this whole thing, Lennon, me, the book, is so much bigger than guilty and not guilty. Unless you know the book, unless you know me, you can't really understand it.
I think people have fantasies all the time, and people identify with stories they read all the time. You become involved in a book or you become involved in a movie, but to have it become your life and use it as a script for carrying out some very strongly felt mission is something quite unusual, and I think he identifies with the gentleness of Holden Caulfield, because Mark identifies also with the innocent children of the world. He sees himself as their advocate. He feels himself to be one of the innocent children of the world, and he is going to do everything in his power to avoid hitting the bottom of that cliff. Mark probably saw John Lennon as a representative of, a very well-known representative of an individual who had been an innocent child and had fallen off the cliff and become an evil, exploitative, phony adult, and deserving of whatever punishment Mark was going to mete out.
People who identify with characters in books and films and begin to take on some of their characteristics in real life are choosing to do that. It's fashionable to think of this as an involuntary process in which somehow the individual's mind is taken over by the character, or they become possessed, a kind of demonological view of it. But in fact, they're choosing to go to that film, they're choosing that character for identification. And it is a normal process of development to choose particular features from role models, to choose what we want to be from among the various options available to us. The individual who subjects himself repeatedly to exposure to inappropriate models, who takes on those characteristics to try to become like that, is choosing his fate. The role of the artist is to invent fantasy worlds. People may choose to enter them temporarily, enjoy them, and leave and exit to reality. But for a large segment of our population, the fantasy world becomes reality, and there are those who live within that fantasy.
Central Park, not far from the Dakota, not far from the Carousel. Here, every Saturday, children come to listen to stories beneath the statue of Hans Christian Andersen. This has been a story, in part, about the power of stories. But it would be unfair to that story in particular, and certainly to Holden and what he held dear, to have to bear responsibility for what happened. That lies in the mind of a young man who chose to change the story and call it his own. The tragedy is that it came true. December 1980, outside the Dakota. Somewhere in the crowd, another young man with a gun in his pocket. His name is John Hinckley. 4 months later, after he shot President Reagan, police broke into Hinckley's hotel room. Among his possessions, they found a well-thumbed copy of The Catcher in the Rye.